Ever wondered if being single and child-free was always a personal choice, or if ancient societies had something to say about it? Get ready for a wild ride through time, because the way our ancestors looked at unmarried and childless adults is a kaleidoscope of surprising laws, social pressures, and sometimes even unexpected freedoms. From Roman emperors imposing taxes on bachelors to cultures where childless spirits were believed to wander eternally hungry, the past is packed with fascinating details. Some societies offered unique, respected roles for those who didn't marry or have children, like the powerful Vestal Virgins in Rome, who held privileges many men envied, or communities where specialized shamans, who were often childless by choice, held immense spiritual authority. You might find out that some ancient laws offered what looked like tax breaks for having kids, while others outright penalized those who stayed single or didn't contribute to the next generation. Number 12. When Rome taxed bachelors and rewarded big families. Ancient Rome, a civilization that stretched from modern-day Britain to Egypt, considered the family unit or familia the cornerstone of society. For many Romans, particularly in the upper classes, marriage and children were not just personal matters but civic duties, essential for the continuation of family lines, property, and the state itself. The first Roman emperor, Augustus, who reigned from 27 before Common Era to 14 Common Era, was particularly concerned about declining birth rates among the Roman elite and the perceived moral laxity of his time. He believed a strong state required a robust population of Roman citizens, especially from the senatorial and equestrian orders. To address this, Augustus introduced a series of laws known collectively as the Julian Laws on marriage and morals. Starting around 18 before Common Era, one key piece of legislation was the Lex Julia de Maritandis Ordinibus, which directly aimed to encourage marriage and procreation. This was later supplemented and modified by the Lex Papia Poppaea in 9 Common Era. Together, these laws created a system of penalties for the unmarried known as caelibs and the childless known as orbi. Within certain age ranges, typically men between 25 and 60 and women between 20 and 50. Those who fell into these categories and remained unmarried or childless faced restrictions on their ability to inherit property and legacies. For example, an unmarried man could not receive inheritances from anyone outside his close family, while a married but childless person could only receive half of an inheritance left to them. Conversely, the laws offered significant rewards for those who married and had children. The most famous of these was the ius trium liberorum, or the right of 3 children. Men with 3 or more legitimate children born in lawful Roman marriage gained privileges such as accelerated advancement in their political careers and exemption from certain civic duties. For women, the ius trium liberorum was even more roy. A freeborn woman who had 3 children, or a freed woman who had 4 children, was released from tutela mulierum, the lifelong legal guardianship of a male relative. This meant she could conduct her own legal and financial affairs without the consent of a guardian, a significant step towards independence. However, Roman society also accommodated individuals who were celibate for religious reasons. The Vestal Virgins are perhaps the most prominent example. These priestesses chosen in childhood dedicated 30 years of their lives to the service of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, home and family. During their tenure, they were bound by a strict vow of celibacy. Far from being marginalized, Vestal Virgins were figures of immense prestige and power. They enjoyed privileges that were extraordinary for women in Rome. They could own property, make a will, and give evidence in court without taking an oath. They had reserved seats at public games and ceremonies, were escorted by lictors, a mark of high office, and even had the power to pardon a condemned criminal if they encountered one by chance on the way to execution. If a Vestal Virgin broke her vow of chastity, the punishment was severe. She was ritually buried alive, and her male partner was flogged to death. After their 30 years of service, Vestals were free to leave the priesthood and marry. Though few reportedly did so, perhaps due to the high status and independence they had enjoyed. Adoption was also a widely practiced and socially accepted way for childless couples, particularly among the elite, to secure an heir and continue the family name and religious rites. Many prominent Romans, including emperors like Augustus himself, who adopted Tiberius, were adopted or adopted heirs. This ensured the transfer of property and the maintenance of family cults, which were important aspects of Roman life. While social pressure to marry and produce natural heirs was strong, adoption provided a legitimate alternative for ensuring lineage continuity. The emphasis was often on having an heir rather than necessarily a biological child. Number 11. Spartan Boot Camp for Babies and Athenian Debates on Singleness. Ancient Greece was not a single unified country, but a collection of city-states, or polis, each with its own laws and customs. Among the most famous were Athens and Sparta, and their views on unmarried and childless adults differed, reflecting their distinct societal priorities. Sparta, located in the Peloponnese region, was a militaristic society fixated on producing strong warriors to maintain control over its large enslaved population, the Helots. For Spartans, procreation was a paramount duty to the state. The laws attributed to the legendary Lycurgus, thought to have lived around the 9th or 8th century before Common Era, heavily hypnotized marriage and childbirth. Spartan men were expected to marry primarily to produce healthy children for the state. Those who married late, or not at all, faced social ridicule and legal disadvantages. Plutarch, a Greek historian writing centuries later but drawing on earlier sources, describes how bachelors in Sparta were subjected to various forms of public shaming. During certain winter festivals, they could be compelled to march naked around the marketplace, singing a song that disparaged their single status and acknowledged their just punishment. They were also denied the respect typically shown by younger men to their elders. If a Spartan man remained unmarried, he was seen as failing in his most fundamental duty. Childless marriages were also problematic. Spartan kings could even be pressured to take a second wife if their first did not produce an heir. The state's interest in healthy offspring was so strong that there were even accounts of practices where, if a man was old and his wife young and capable of bearing children, he might be encouraged to allow a younger, fitter man to impregnate her to produce strong Spartan offspring. Children belonged to the state as much as to the family. In Athens, a city renowned for its democracy, philosophy, and arts, the situation was more nuanced. Though marriage and legitimate children were still highly valued for citizenship, inheritance, and the continuation of the family, oikos household. Athenian law under Solon, around the early 6th century before Common Era, reportedly included measures to encourage marriage. While there might not have been the same overt, state-enforced shaming as in Sparta for bachelors, social pressure was considerable. An unmarried man might find his social standing diminished, and a childless man would worry about the continuation of his family line and the proper performance of ancestral rites after his death. Adoption was a common solution for childless Athenian men to ensure an heir. Athenian women were generally expected to marry young, often in their mid-teens, to men chosen by their fathers. Their primary role was to produce legitimate heirs for their husbands' oikos. A barren wife could be a cause for divorce, although the dowry she brought to the marriage would typically have to be returned. There were, however, some avenues for women outside of typical marriage, particularly in religious cults. Priestesses, for instance, held respected positions, and some roles required celibacy, either temporarily or for longer periods. Desmophoria, an important women-only festival dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, underscored the connection between female fertility and the fertility of the land. Philosophers in Athens and other Greek cities debated the merits of marriage and family. Plato, in his work Laws, written around 348 before Common Era, suggested that men who did not marry by the age of 35 should pay an annual tax, indicating a societal expectation. However, some philosophical schools like the Cynics, and later some Stoics and Epicureans, sometimes advocated for a life free from the entanglements of marriage and family. Believing these could distract from the pursuit of wisdom and virtue, Diogenes the Cynic, living in the 4th century before Common Era, famously flouted all social conventions, including those related to family life. These philosophical stances, however, represented a minority view and were often seen as radical or eccentric by mainstream society. For most ancient Greeks, marriage and children were integral to a complete and socially responsible life. Number 10. Egyptian afterlife. Annuities paid by kids and independent working women. Ancient Egypt, a civilization that flourished for over 3 millennia along the Nile River, starting around 3100 before Common Era, held family and children in high regard. The desire for children was profound, driven by a combination of emotional, social, economic, and religious factors. Children were seen as a blessing from the gods, a source of joy and crucial support for parents in their old age. Perhaps most importantly, children, particularly sons, played a vital role in ensuring their parents' successful transition to and sustenance in the afterlife. It was the duty of the eldest son, or a designated heir, to perform the opening of the mouth ceremony at the funeral, a ritual believed to reanimate the deceased and enable them to eat, drink, and speak in the afterlife. He was also responsible for maintaining the funerary cult, providing ongoing offerings of food and drink at the tomb to nourish the deceased's Ka, life force, and Ba, soul. Without these rites, it was feared that the deceased might suffer or even cease to exist in the afterlife. Marriage was the societal norm, typically occurring at a young age, girls around 12 to 14, and boys a few years older. While there were no state laws compelling marriage or penalizing childlessness in the same way as in Augustan Rome, the social and religious pressures were immense. Texts like the Instructions of Amenemhotep, dating to the Ramesside period, circa 1300–1070 before Common Era, advised young men to take a wife when you are young, that she may make a son for you. Infertility was a source of great distress, and individuals and couples sought remedies through prayers, offerings to fertility, deities like Hathor, Min, and Tauret, and magical spells or medical treatments. Adoption was a known practice and provided a way for childless individuals or couples to have an heir who could fulfill the necessary funerary duties and inherit property. Divorce was permissible, and infertility on the part of the wife could be a reason for a man to take a second wife or a concubine. Though monogamy appears to have been the ideal for most, despite the strong emphasis on marriage and motherhood, evidence suggests that ancient Egyptian women could enjoy a relatively high degree of legal and economic independence compared to their counterparts in some other ancient societies. Women could own, inherit, and bequeath property independently of their husbands. They could enter into contracts, initiate legal proceedings, and operate businesses. We have records of women engaging in various professions, such as weavers, bakers, brewers, mourners, musicians, and even priestesses, though high-ranking priestly roles were more commonly held by men. There are also depictions and textual references to women working alongside men in agricultural settings. This economic potential meant that an unmarried or widowed woman, if she had means or skills, might not be entirely dependent on male relatives. However, The ideal path for a woman was still generally seen as marriage and motherhood. There is less direct information about adult unmarried women who were not widows or part of a religious institution. Society was structured around family units. While specific religious roles might have involved celibacy, these were exceptions rather than common alternatives for a large number of women. For men, while marriage was expected, a bachelor might not have faced the same level of direct stigma as in Sparta, but he would still lack the social completeness and the assurance of funerary rights that a family provided. The desire for children was so ingrained that many tomb depictions and personal prayers highlight the joy of family life and the hope for offspring to carry on one's name and legacy. The concept of a solitary life without descendants to care for one's mortuary cult was a grim prospect for many ancient Egyptians. Number 9. When Confucius said, "Family first and childless ghosts wandered hungry in China." In ancient China, particularly under the influence of Confucianism, which became state ideology during the Han Dynasty, 206 before Common Era, 220 Common Era, the family was the fundamental unit of society, and filial piety, respect, and obedience to one's parents and elders was the paramount virtue. Marriage was not primarily about individual happiness, but about continuing the ancestral line, ensuring the performance of ancestor worship rites, and maintaining social order. Procreation, especially the birth of sons, was of utmost importance. Sons were necessary to carry on the family name, inherit property, care for parents in their old age, and, crucially, perform the ancestral rituals. Without these rituals, it was believed that the spirits of the deceased ancestors would become hungry ghosts, wandering aimlessly and potentially causing misfortune to the living. Therefore, being unmarried or childless carried significant social and spiritual weight. For a man, failing to marry and produce an heir was considered a major breach of filial duty. Mencius, a prominent Confucian philosopher of the 4th century before Common Era, stated that there were 3 unfilial acts, and the worst was to have no descendants. This sentiment echoed through centuries of Chinese thought. While there might not have been specific laws directly penalizing bachelors in the same way as in some Western cultures, the social pressure was immense. An unmarried man might be seen as incomplete, irresponsible, or even unfilial. His position within the extended family and lineage would be diminished. For women, marriage was considered virtually obligatory. A woman's life was largely defined by her 3 obediences: to her father before marriage, to her husband after marriage, and to her sons in widowhood. Her primary role within her husband's family was to produce sons. Infertility was a grave concern and could be grounds for a man to divorce his wife or take a concubine. The pressure on women to bear children, particularly sons, was intense. A daughter-in-law who failed to produce an heir could face mistreatment from her husband and his family. Adoption was practiced, often within the wider clan, to ensure the continuation of a lineage if a couple was childless. A nephew might be designated as an heir. There were, however, some exceptions or alternative paths, though they were not mainstream. Buddhism, which arrived in China during the Han Dynasty and gained popularity over subsequent centuries, introduced the concept of monasticism for both men and women. Buddhist monks and nuns took vows of celibacy and renounced family life to pursue spiritual enlightenment. This offered an alternative path for individuals who, for various reasons, did not marry or have children. Buddhist monasteries and nunneries became places where some unmarried or widowed individuals could find a community and a purpose outside the traditional family structure. However, even this path was sometimes viewed with ambivalence by Confucian traditionalists, as it involved severing family ties and ceasing to contribute to the ancestral line. Taoism, Another influential indigenous philosophy and religion also had traditions of hermits and adepts who might live solitary or celibate lives in pursuit of spiritual cultivation and immortality. These figures often existed on the fringes of mainstream society. In terms of social status, an adult who remained unmarried and childless without adopting or having a recognized religious role would likely have faced considerable challenges. They would lack the social support network of a family, might have uncertain economic prospects in old age, and would be unable to fulfill the deeply ingrained cultural and religious expectation of continuing the ancestral line. The spiritual well-being of both the individual and their ancestors was seen as intrinsically linked to having descendants. Number 8. The Indian quest for sons and the 4 stages of a proper life. In ancient India, from the Vedic period, circa 1500–500 before Common Era, through the Classical era, society was largely structured around the principles of Dharma, which encompasses duty, righteousness, and cosmic order. Family life, known as Grahastha Ashrama, the householder stage, was considered a crucial part of this order and a vital stage in a person's life. Marriage was seen as a sacrament and a social obligation, essential for procreation, performing religious sacrifices, childlessness, and repaying the 3 debts to the gods, to the sages, and to the ancestors. The debt to the ancestors was repaid by having children, especially sons, who would continue the lineage and perform the Shraddha rites, funerary rituals, necessary for the nourishment and peaceful passage of ancestral spirits in the afterlife. The ashrama system, which became more systematized in post-Vedic texts, like the Dharma Shastras, treatises on Dharma, composed Radish, Complete Station, Binanda Falm Ibermacher. While the Grahastha stage was central, the system acknowledged that celibacy was appropriate for the student and the renouncer. However, deliberately choosing to remain unmarried and childless throughout one's life, bypassing the householder stage without becoming a sannyasin, renouncer, was generally not the societal ideal for most people. The desire for sons was particularly strong. Sons ensured the continuation of the family name, inherited property, provided economic support, and, most importantly, performed the necessary ancestral rites. Texts like the Laws of Manu, Manusmriti, compiled around the 2nd century Common Era, emphasized the importance of having a son to save the father from a hell called Put. Childlessness was a source of anxiety and sorrow. Various rituals, prayers, and even medical remedies, as described in Akhardic texts, were sought by childless couples. Adoption, particularly of a son from within the extended family, was a recognized practice to mitigate the consequences of childlessness. For women, marriage was considered almost essential. Her identity and social standing were largely derived from her husband and her role as a wife and mother. While women were respected within the family, their primary religious and social duty was often seen as supporting their husbands and raising children. Texts generally prescribed early marriage for girls. There were limited socially sanctioned roles for unmarried women outside of certain ascetic traditions, or in some cases as courtesans, kanikas, who could be educated and hold a degree of independence, though this was not the mainstream path. A barren wife could face social disapproval, and her husband might be permitted to take another wife to obtain offspring, although the first wife usually retained her status and rights. However, ancient Indian traditions also held celibacy in high esteem within specific spiritual contexts. Ascetics, sages, rishis, yogis, and later Buddhist and Jain monks and nuns embraced celibacy as a path to spiritual power, wisdom, and liberation, moksha. These individuals often commanded great respect in society. The sannyasa stage of life explicitly involved renouncing worldly attachments, including family. So, while remaining unmarried and childless by choice, outside of a recognized spiritual path, was unconventional for a householder. Celibacy for religious reasons was a deeply respected ideal. This created a complex social landscape where procreation was a fundamental duty for most, but renunciation of that duty for higher spiritual pursuits was also a valid, albeit less common, life choice, particularly towards the end of one's life or for those specifically dedicated to a spiritual vocation from a younger age. The societal view thus depended heavily on the context and the individual's stated purpose. Number 7. Mesopotamian adoption, contracts, and when barrenness could mean divorce. In Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, home to early civilizations like Sumer, circa 3500–2300 before Common Era, and Babylon, circa 1894–539 before Common Era. Family was the basic social and economic unit. Marriage was a contractual arrangement, often orchestrated by families, aimed at procreation, companionship, and economic stability. Children, particularly sons, were desired to continue the family line, inherit property, manage the family estate, and provide support for parents in their old age. They also played a role in funerary cults, ensuring the deceased ancestors received offerings and remembrance, which was believed to keep their spirits content in the netherworld. Legal codes from Mesopotamia, such as the famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, circa 1754 before Common Era, provide significant insights into societal attitudes towards marriage, children, and childlessness. These laws regulated marriage, divorce, inheritance, and adoption. For instance, Hammurabi's code outlines provisions for a man whose wife was barren. Law 138 states that if a man wishes to divorce a wife who has not borne him children, he must return her dowry and also give her the marriage gift. If she had no dowry, he had to give her 1 mina of silver. This indicates that childlessness was a recognized reason for divorce, though the wife was entitled to some financial protection. Alternatively, a man with a barren wife could take a second wife or a slave girl as a concubine specifically to bear children. Laws 144–147. If the first wife herself gave her husband a slave girl to produce children, and that slave girl then tried to claim equal status with the mistress could demote her back to slave status. These laws highlight the immense importance placed on securing heirs. Adoption was a well-established and legally regulated practice in Mesopotamia. Numerous cuneiform tablets document adoption contracts. Childless couples often adopted children to ensure they had an heir to inherit their property and, importantly, to perform the necessary duties for their care in old age and their funerary cult after death. Sometimes artisans or craftsmen would adopt sons to train them in their trade and ensure the continuation of their workshop. The adopted child, usually a male, would have legal rights similar to those of a natural-born son, including the right to inherit. This practice demonstrates a pragmatic approach to overcoming childlessness and fulfilling societal expectations regarding lineage and inheritance. For women, their primary role was seen as wife and mother. While women in Mesopotamia could own property, engage in business, and even act as witnesses in legal cases, their status was significantly enhanced by motherhood, especially by bearing sons. There were also specific roles for women outside typical marriage within religious contexts. For example, Naditu women in Babylonia, particularly those dedicated to the god Shamash in Sippar, were a distinct group. These women often came from wealthy families, lived in a cloistered part of the temple complex, and were not supposed to bear children, effectively living a celibate life. They could engage in business activities, own and inherit property, and lend money. Their status suggests a socially recognized alternative to marriage and motherhood for some women linked to religious service and economic activity. However, this was a specific institution and not a common path for all unmarried women. There is less direct information on the social standing of men who remained unmarried by choice and were not part of a priestly class. Given the emphasis on family continuity and economic cooperation within family units, an adult man without a wife or children might have faced social and economic disadvantages unless he had another defined role in society, such as a specialized craftsman attached to a larger household or temple. The legal and social structures were heavily geared towards family units as the norm for economic production, social organization, and religious continuity. The extensive legal provisions for adoption underscore the societal drive to ensure that individuals and family lines had heirs, mitigating the social and personal consequences of natural childlessness. Number 6. Viking raids for riches, not wives, and the power of the Norse matriarch. In Norse society during the Viking Age, roughly late 8th to mid-11th centuries, Common Era, family and lineage were central to an individual's identity, rights, and social standing. Marriage was a crucial institution for forging alliances between families, transferring property, and importantly, producing legitimate heirs to inherit land, titles, and social obligations. Children were essential for the continuation of the kindred group, ate or king, which provided its members with protection, support in legal disputes. Feuds were common, and a sense of belonging. Persons' honor and reputation were deeply intertwined with their family. While there were no formal laws like those in Rome penalizing bachelorhood, social expectations heavily favored marriage and procreation. A man without a wife and children might be seen as lacking in social completeness and influence. For chieftains and powerful individuals, having numerous sons could enhance their power and security. Inheritance laws, which varied across regions and time, generally favored legitimate children, particularly sons, for the transmission of ancestral lands and status. Childlessness could be a source of concern, potentially leading to the end of a lineage or disputes over inheritance. Icelandic sagas, written a couple of centuries after the Viking Age, but drawing on older oral traditions, often depict the importance of heirs and the complexities of family relationships. Adoption, though perhaps not as formalized as in Rome, was known, and fostering children in other households was a common practice to build alliances and provide education. Norse women, particularly those of the landowning class, could wield considerable authority within the household husfreyja, or lady of the house. They were responsible for managing the farm and domestic affairs, especially when their husbands were away trading, raiding, or at the thing, local assembly. Upon marriage, a woman typically received a dowry from her family and a mourning gift from her husband, both of which remained her property. If a marriage ended, she usually retained these. While their primary expected role was to be a wife and mother, Norse women had more legal rights and autonomy than women in many other contemporary European societies. They could inherit property, though usually less than their brothers, initiate divorce, and were legally protected against mistreatment. There is less specific information about the social status of women who never married or were childless by choice or circumstance outside of widowhood. Society was strongly kin-based, and an individual's position was largely defined by their family connections. A woman without a husband or children might rely more heavily on her natal family for support and status. There were, however, figures in Norse mythology and sagas who represent alternatives to the typical wife and mother. Seeresses, Volurti, or sorceresses, for example, often appear as powerful, independent women who might live outside conventional family structures. Their magical knowledge and prophetic abilities could give them significant influence and respect or fear. Whether these figures reflect a recognized social role for some real-life unmarried or childless women is debatable, but suggests cultural archetypes beyond the purely domestic. For men, remaining unmarried was unusual for those who could afford to support a family. The sagas sometimes portray men who marry late, Perhaps after establishing themselves through raiding or trade, economic capability was a factor in marriage. A man needed to be able to provide for a wife and children. While there wasn't overt legal punishment for bachelorhood, the social and practical benefits of having a family, heirs, labor, alliances, and social standing were substantial. The term ENVG, lone warrior or single man, could sometimes carry connotations of someone outside the normal social fabric, though it could also refer to a formidable individual. The strong emphasis on honor, lineage, and the continuation of the family meant that marriage and children were deeply ingrained expectations for both men and women in Norse society. Number 5. When be fruitful and multiply was a commandment for ancient Israelites. For the ancient Israelites, whose history and laws are primarily recorded in the Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, or Old Testament, marriage and procreation were not merely social customs, but religious obligations deeply embedded in their covenantal relationship with God. The very first divine commandment given to humanity in the book of Genesis, 1:28, is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This imperative set a strong precedent. Children were seen as a blessing from God, a sign of divine favor, and essential for the continuation of the covenant people and the lineage of Abraham. Large families were often celebrated as a mark of prosperity and God's blessing. Psalm chapter 127, verse 3-5. Consequently, remaining unmarried or childless was generally viewed as a misfortune or a deviation from the ideal. For men, marriage was expected, and it was a man's duty to establish a household and father children. There was no formal legal penalty for bachelorhood in the Mosaic Law, but the social and religious expectation was overwhelming. A man who did not marry and have children was failing to fulfill a primary religious duty. Childlessness within a marriage was a source of great sorrow and could carry a social stigma, particularly for women. The stories of matriarchs like Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel in Genesis, who initially struggled with infertility and fervently prayed for children, highlight the profound cultural and personal importance attached to childbearing. Hannah's prayer for a son, 1 Samuel 1, is another poignant example. The institution of Yibern, or Levirate marriage, described in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5-10, gusks the importance of perpetuating a man's lineage. If a married man died without a son, his brother was obligated to marry the widow. The first son born from this union would be considered the heir of the deceased brother, thus ensuring his name and inheritance continued. If the brother-in-law refused to perform this duty, he would undergo a public ceremony of shame called halizah. This practice demonstrates the extreme lengths to which society would go to prevent a family line from dying out. For women, their identity and value were heavily tied to their roles as wives and mothers. Marriage was the expected path, and bearing children, especially sons, was crucial for her status within her husband's family and the community. Barrenness was a significant trial, and women often bore the brunt of the social disappointment associated with a childless marriage. While the law provided protections for women in various circumstances, there were few socially recognized roles for adult women outside of marriage and motherhood. Widows had certain protections but often faced vulnerability unless they had sons to support them or remarried. While lifelong celibacy was not a widespread ideal or common practice in ancient Israelite society for the general populace, there were individuals who, according to tradition, may have lived unmarried or celibate lives in service to God. The prophet Jeremiah, for instance, was commanded by God not to marry or have children as a sign of the impending doom and desolation facing Judah. Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 4. Some interpretations suggest that certain prophets or figures within specific religious groups, like the Nazarites, who took special vows, though not always including lifelong celibacy, might have lived lives that diverged from the typical pattern of marriage and family. Later, in the Second Temple period, circa 516 before Common Era, 70 Common Era, some Jewish sects like the Essenes, known from the Dead Sea Scrolls, are believed to have practiced celibacy as part of their communal religious life, although this was an exception rather than the rule for Judaism as a whole. For the vast majority of ancient Israelites, fulfilling the commandment to be fruitful and multiply was a central tenet of life and faith. Number 4. Early Christians debating babies. V's devotion in the Roman world. The emergence of Christianity in the 1st century Common Era within the Roman Empire brought about a significant shift in perspectives on marriage, celibacy, and childlessness, diverging in some notable ways from both traditional Jewish and Greco-Roman norms. While the Hebrew Bible emphasized procreation as a divine commandment, and Roman society finibized marriage and childbirth for civic reasons, early Christian thought began to elevate voluntary celibacy and virginity, particularly when chosen for the sake of devotion to God and the kingdom of heaven. Jesus himself, as portrayed in the Gospels, was unmarried and childless, and he spoke of those who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 19, verse 12, suggesting a spiritual value to renouncing marriage for religious purposes. The Apostle Paul, a pivotal figure in early Christian theology, discussed marriage and celibacy extensively in his letters, notably in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, written around 53-54 Common Era. Paul, who was himself unmarried, expressed a personal preference for celibacy, stating, "I wish that all were as I myself am. To the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am." 1 Corinthians 7, 7-8. He argued that the unmarried could devote themselves more fully to the affairs of the Lord without the worldly anxieties associated with marriage and family, especially in light of the belief in Christ's imminent return. However, Paul also acknowledged marriage as good and necessary for those who lacked the gift of celibacy, stating, "It is better to marry than to burn with passion." 1 Corinthians 7:9. He did not condemn marriage, but offered celibacy as a higher calling for those capable of it. This new valuation of voluntary celibacy provided an alternative spiritual path that did not necessarily involve procreation. Over the following centuries, as Christianity spread, the ideal of virginity and ascetic self-denial gained prominence, particularly with the rise of monasticism in the 3rd and 4th centuries Common Era. Figures like Antony of Egypt, circa 251-356 Common Era, who retreated to the desert to live as a hermit, inspired many to pursue lives of solitary devotion or communal monasticism, where celibacy was a core commitment. Communities of virgins and widows dedicated to prayer and service also emerged. These individuals, both men and women who chose not to marry or have children for religious reasons, were often highly esteemed within the Christian community, seen as embodying a profound spiritual commitment. This did not mean that marriage and family were devalued entirely. Marriage was still considered a sacred institution, a great mystery, likened by Paul to the relationship between Christ and the Church, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32. The majority of Christians continued to marry and raise families. However, the emphasis shifted from procreation as a primary duty, as in Judaism or Roman civic thinking, to companionship, mutual support, and the spiritual upbringing of children within a Christian framework. Childlessness within marriage, while potentially a source of personal sadness, did not necessarily carry the same level of social or religious stigma as in some other ancient cultures, especially if the couple was devout. The focus was more on the spiritual state of the individuals. For women, the Christian emphasis on spiritual equality, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, For you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, and the valorization of virginity and aedacy. Women who chose a life of consecrated celibacy or dedicated widowhood could achieve a degree of independence and spiritual authority that was often unavailable through traditional marriage. Figures like Macrina the Younger, circa 330–379 Common Era, the sister of prominent theologians Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa, established monastic communities and were revered for their piety and wisdom. This created respected roles for unmarried or childless women that were not solely defined by their relationship to men or their reproductive capacity. The rise of Christianity thus introduced a complex interplay of ideas upholding marriage, while simultaneously offering and, in some contexts, proselytizing celibacy as a path of spiritual excellence. Number 3. Aztec warriors needed heirs and a society built on family units. The Aztec Empire, which flourished in central Mexico from the 14th to the early 16th centuries Common Era until its conquest by the Spanish starting in 1519, was a highly organized and hierarchical society with a strong emphasis on communities. Marriage and family were fundamental to the social structure. For the Aztecs, also known as the Mexica households, were the basic units of production and taxation, and kinship ties formed the basis of larger social groups, like the Copuli, a neighborhood or clan-like landholding unit. Procreation was essential not only for the continuation of the family and Copuli, but also for providing future warriors, agricultural laborers, and individuals to serve the state and the gods. Marriage was the expected norm for adults. Men typically married in their late teens or early 20s, and women somewhat younger. Marriages were often arranged, involving negotiations between families, while polygyny, a man having multiple wives, was practiced. It was more common among the nobility and wealthy, who could afford to support larger households. For commoners, monogamy was more typical. Children were highly valued and seen as gifts from the gods. Their upbringing involved strict discipline and education in gender-specific roles and societal values. Boys were trained for warfare or their father's trade, while girls learned domestic skills, weaving, and religious duties. Given the societal structure and the importance of contributing to the Copuli and the state, remaining unmarried into adulthood would have been unusual and likely socially disadvantageous. There were no specific laws imposing direct penalties on bachelors like in Augustan Rome, but the social and economic mechanisms of Aztec society were built around family units. An unmarried adult might find it difficult to establish an independent household or secure a full share in Copuli lands, which were typically allocated to family heads. Warriors, who held a high status in Aztec society, were expected to marry and produce children to continue their warrior lineage and to provide new generations of defenders for the empire. Childlessness within a marriage would have been a concern. While specific legal remedies, like those in Hammurabi's Code, are not as clearly documented for the Aztecs, in the same way, the general Mesoamerican emphasis on lineage continuity suggests that couples would have sought remedies through religious rituals or perhaps adoption. Although detailed information on Aztec adoptions for commoners is somewhat limited, the continuation of the family line was important for maintaining ancestral connections and ensuring that domestic religious rites were performed. There were, however, some recognized roles that involved celibacy, particularly within the religious sphere. Both male and female priests served in the temples dedicated to the vast Aztec pantheon. Some priestly roles required celibacy at least for the period of service. For example, young men and women dedicated to certain deities might live in temple compounds for a period, undergoing rigorous training, fasting, and penance, which could include sexual abstinence. Priestesses, particularly those from noble families, could hold significant religious authority. These roles offered an alternative path for some individuals, where celibacy was part of a sacred duty rather than a social failing. However, these positions were specific and not available to the general population as a broad alternative to marriage. For the vast majority of Aztecs, life revolved around the family and community. The social and economic systems were predicated on individuals marrying, forming households, and contributing to the collective through labor, tribute, and for men military service. An adult who remained outside this framework without a specific recognized alternative role, like a priest, would likely have occupied a marginal position in society. The emphasis was on fulfilling one's duties to the family, the Kalpuli, and the state, and these duties were almost invariably tied to marriage and procreation. Number 2. When unmarried, Japanese nobles wrote poetry and courtly love was complicated. In ancient Japan, particularly during the Heian period, 794 to 1185 Common Era, a time renowned for its refined court culture, art and literature, marriage and family were central to the social and political landscape, especially for the aristocracy. However, the views and experiences of unmarried and childless adults were nuanced, shaped by class, gender, and the unique cultural currents of the era. For the Heian nobility, marriages were primarily strategic alliances between families aimed at consolidating power, wealth, and influence. Producing heirs was crucial for the continuation of these powerful clans. Men in the Heian aristocracy often practiced polygyny, maintaining a principal wife, often from a family of similar or higher rank, and several secondary wives or consorts of lower status. The status of a woman and her children depended heavily on her relationship with the male head of the household and her natal family's influence. For aristocratic women, marriage was the primary path to social standing and security. Their ability to produce heirs, particularly sons, could significantly impact their position within the complex web of court politics. Childlessness for a principal wife could be a source of anxiety and could lead to her husband focusing more attention and resources on other wives who bore him children. Despite this, Heian literature, much of it written by court ladies, reveals a world where women could achieve recognition for their intellect, poetic skill, and artistic talents, sometimes independently of their marital or maternal status. Works like The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, circa 1000–1012 Common Era, and The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon, circa 1002 Common Era, provide glimpses into the lives, thoughts, and emotions of aristocratic women. While marriage was the norm, these texts also depict women who navigate complex relationships, experience periods of solitude, or find fulfillment in artistic pursuits, and female friendships within the court. Some women served as ladies-in-waiting at court, a position that could offer intellectual stimulation and a degree of autonomy, though their ultimate prospects often still involved marriage. For women of lower social classes, the pressures and realities were different. Their lives were more focused on agricultural labor or artisanal production within family units. Marriage and children were essential for economic survival and mutual support. There were fewer avenues for independent existence outside the family structure. Buddhism, which was deeply influential in Heian Japan, offered an alternative path for both men and women through monasticism, becoming a monk or nun involved, renouncing worldly ties, including marriage and family, and taking vows of celibacy. This was a respected choice, often made for spiritual reasons, but sometimes also due to personal misfortune, political setbacks, or widowhood. Buddhist convents provided a refuge and a community for some women who did not marry, were widowed, or wished to dedicate their lives to religious practice. These women could engage in scholarly pursuits, artistic endeavors, and religious rituals. There isn't strong evidence of specific legal penalties for remaining unmarried in the Heian period, similar to Roman laws. However, The social structure, inheritance patterns, and the importance of family alliances meant that remaining single was not the common or preferred path, especially for those in positions of power or those needing the economic support of a family unit. A man of status was expected to marry and produce heirs to carry on his lineage and responsibilities. An unmarried noblewoman might depend on her male relatives for support. The intricate system of patronage and kinship at the high-end court heavily favored those who were part of established family networks, and marriage was the primary way to create and maintain these networks. While the refined culture allowed for expressions of individual sentiment and artistic achievement outside the strict confines of marital roles, the underlying social framework still strongly emphasized marriage and the continuation of family lines as fundamental to societal order and individual standing. Number 1. Celtic bards, druidesses, and when land laws favored families in ancient Ireland. In ancient Celtic societies which spanned a wide area of Europe before and during the Roman period and continued in places like Ireland well into the early medieval era, kinship, lineage, and community were paramount. While Celtic encompasses diverse groups over a vast timeframe, early Irish law tracts, such as those compiled from the 7th and 8th centuries Common Era, but reflecting older traditions, provide some of the most detailed insights into their social structures regarding family. In these societies, an individual's legal standing, rights, and obligations were largely determined by their kin group fine in Irish. Marriage was a key institution for forming alliances, managing property, and ensuring the continuation of the lineage. Children were highly valued as they represented the future of the kin group, provided labor, and would eventually take on responsibilities for supporting elderly family members and maintaining the family's honor and property. Irish law recognized various forms of marriage and unions, with differing implications for the status of women and children and the inheritance of property. Having legitimate heirs was crucial, especially for landowners and those of noble status, as land was often held by the kin group rather than individuals in the modern sense. Childlessness could therefore be a significant concern for the continuity of the family's status and holdings. Fosterage, the practice of sending children to be raised in other households, often of relatives or allies, was extremely common and served to strengthen social bonds, but it was predicated on having children in the first place. For men, being the head of a household with a wife and children was the norm and conferred full legal status and responsibilities within the community. While there might not have been direct legal penalties for bachelorhood in the same way as some other cultures, an adult man without a family unit might have a less established position in society and fewer means to participate fully in the economic and social exchanges that revolved around kin groups. His ability to command resources, contribute to the kin group's strength, and participate in legal and political matters could be linked to his status as a householder. For women, marriage was the typical path. Their status was often tied to that of their father or husband, but early Irish law also granted women certain property rights. A woman brought a dowry to her marriage, and she could hold personal property. Different types of marital unions offered varying degrees of autonomy and rights. Motherhood, particularly the bearing of sons to continue the lineage, was highly important. However, Celtic societies also featured powerful female figures in mythology and potentially in reality. Queens. Warrior women like Boudica of the Iceni, who led a revolt against Rome in 60–61 Common Era, and druidesses or seeresses suggest that women could occupy roles of significant authority and influence that were not solely defined by marriage or motherhood. There were specific roles within Celtic society that may have involved celibacy or a life outside conventional marriage. Druids, who were the priests, judges, scholars, and philosophers of Celtic society, underwent long periods of training, reportedly up to 20 years. While it's not definitively clear that all Druids were celibate, Their dedication to sacred learning and religious duties might have set some of them apart from typical family life. Similarly, there are references to bandrui, female druids, or prophetesses, like the Valletta mentioned by Tacitus among the Germanic tribes, culturally related in some aspects, who held respected spiritually from other women. Bards and poets, who also held esteemed positions, relied on their skills and knowledge, and their marital status might have been secondary to their craft, though many would have had families. In general, the kin-based nature of Celtic societies meant that individuals outside a strong family network could be vulnerable, while adoption or the absorption of distant relatives into a household could mitigate childlessness for a lineage. The expectation for adults was largely to marry and contribute to the strength and continuity of their kin. Complex laws surrounding inheritance, honor, price, a person's legal standing, and the compensation due for injury or insult, and social obligations were all deeply intertwined with family structures. Those who remained unmarried and childless, without a specialized role like a druid or a renowned bard, would likely have had a more ambiguous and potentially less secure place within the societal framework.